Well, good evening, everyone. My name is Ricardo de Ostos. I'll be the host for the lecture tonight. Just before I start, turn off your mobile phones so the lecture doesn't get interrupted in this whole duration. Well, it's a real honor to have Peter Cook tonight here with us once again after he ran his lecture series, Lunchtime. I think the moment for this lecture is very important in the period that the school is passing, in the sense of projects review and also in the sense of what is design and what's the role of architecture. In a very interesting way, having the chance to study with Peter down the road at the antagonist school called the Bartlett, he had a fantastic sense of energy, a fantastic sense of direction, a fantastic sense of identity. And I think that's a wonderful opportunity for us to watch Peter tonight speaking about, hopefully, 3 or more of his metamorphoses through his career, not just through a very famous visionary, which became a historical figure along the way, but also extremely successful educator. That not just the Bartlett, but I'll say that the Bartlett became a relevant school in the architectural map. In other words, became a design school where different talents, different kind of people were brought, not just along the corner in Essex, but also from a much more variety international scene. I think this is all possible not only through will, but also a relentless and very unique vision of how things should be done. So once more, it's a fantastic opportunity to have this lecture at this moment in time. I'd like also to thank Larry Malik from HOK, as the slide is saying, for sponsoring this lecture. And everyone present. I think the lecture hall is getting fuller by the minute, people coming from the bar. So I'd like to thank you very much for coming, and please help and welcome me, Peter Cook.
In the process of covering a lot of material, in a sense, this evening is a post-rationalization and a pre-rationalization. This is, of course, a post-rationalization of work that probably rolls back over a number of years, but also will include a little bit of references, in fact, more than a little bit of references to the work of other people, alive and dead. Because in making some degree of post-rationalization, one is trying to say more than is necessarily represented by the pictures on the wall. One is trying to, in a sense, not position oneself forevermore, but to position one's view of what one does as seen from this moment in some kind of relationship to other work. And in talking about non-solid, or suddenly using this rather ungainly term non-solid, I think it will emerge that I don't know that there is a single alternative to non-solidity, but that certain kinds of solidity get up my nose, and I sort of I tap myself on the hand when I find myself doing it, through a series of I suppose, moments of fascination and inspiration. And the bottom line, which says a realization, wasn't that I woke up one day and said, of course what I'm doing is no non-solid architecture. It was more to suggest that one was realizing that certain kinds of things that you did or that you liked were leading towards a sort of syndrome of non-solidity. Is that light going to stay on? Is that needed for... Not really. Good. I come from the seaside, or at least this is one of several layers of convenience that I use from time to time which saves a lot of discussion, a lot of bother. In fact, I lived in about 14 English provincial towns, of which only 3 were seaside. But it's perhaps the seaside ones that have resonated more than the others. And I refer on the left to Felixstowe, which is a rather insignificant seaside town, somewhere on the east coast, a rather small one, where I certainly at that time, though I think I wanted to be an architect roughly from the age of 12, I think I was in Felixstowe when I was about 10. Therefore, it hadn't sort of sunk in at that point. And there's probably still there's a sort of funny old fun fair at the southern end of Felixstowe, which has a helter-skelter, a crazy house, and a sort of indeterminate building, which, if you look closely, is a sort of East Anglian Art Deco. And I didn't know that it was even remotely Art Deco. I thought the crazy house was rather fun, and I instinctively thought, why aren't buildings like that? And the helter-skelter, which may or may not have manifested itself later in Plug-in City, who is to say, all these things were sort of just stuff that you saw and didn't even consciously collect. But as I get older, I realize that something between the world of the helter-skelter, the world of the superstructure, the megastructure, the crazy thing in the sky where you have a momentary experience, but you could actually plug buildings into it, thought I later, and the crazy house, which seems to suggest a distortion of the normal rectilinear architecture. And even Art Deco, can I post-rationalize that? Well, the notion of doing things for reasons of beauty, which my wife writes books about, is perhaps not that far away, although I'm sure she would not consider the building on the right beautiful. Later, and more famously, I went and lived in and started to study architecture in a larger, more discussable town called Bournemouth. And I won't go into the details of Bournemouth as a whole, except to mention the cliff lift, which I think is still, the cliff lifts are still there. At the time you paid a penny to go up the cliff, and if you were very unenergetic, you paid a penny to go down the cliff. And the device was a sort of Victorian machine attached to the cliff. And I think, again, and this of course you have to bear in mind, one was beginning to slightly consciously think, I wouldn't mind being an architect. But one wasn't remotely going to be an engineer. And yet it was the engineering apparatus which perhaps linked to things like Meccano sets and toy planes and things that you wound up rubber bands and put pins into. It was that aspect of let's see how it works, because now we live in a world when you can't open an alarm clock because you don't know what the hell's inside it. It's just a series of chips. At that time, if something went wrong, or even if it didn't go wrong, you enjoyed opening it up and trying to make an alarm clock into a tractor or whatever else. And I think that the Bournemouth Cliff Lift is connected with that world, the world of the invention as a nonchalant insertion into the city. But as I have often mentioned, probably every second lecture that I give these days includes my reference to Gunnar Asplin's Paradise Restaurant of the Stockholm exhibition of 1930, because, and I will repeat my standard phrase on it, because I had not seen any building like this when I discovered it in a book in the Bournemouth Public Library when I was probably about 15. I'd already started reading about architecture. I'd lived in cities with medieval churches. I had made balsa wood cathedrals. But I hadn't seen anything like this, which reminded me, if anything, of a sort of biplane or a kite or a strange conglomeration of the mechanics of translucent parts. Subsequently, one could reanalyze the building. I've tried to collect lots of pictures of it. Of course, they weren't color photographs when it was built. It was already pulled down several years before I was born. But one likes to imagine it. And it's interesting, in the lecture I gave here a week ago, I was comparing this particular more heroic view of it with other renditions of it, trying to get to something which it would be impossible for one to see. I think out of that one can make the prognosis that, in fact, sometimes one's imagining of the reality of something is actually better than if you saw the real reality. There's a sort of catch-as-catch-can game played between the imagined imagination, the document, and the reality. We all know the power of the beautifully taken photograph of the third-rate building. But I feel that underlying all of this instinct for aspects of architecture not just explained by the four square, and aspects of the city that it produces, represents, the more I travel around, and I do travel an extremely excessive amount these days, it represents certain fundamental differences of approach between different kinds, not only building typology, but urban experience. I will cite now a city which my wife does not like, but I like, which is Norwich. If we look at this particularly sort of glossy-looking photograph of Norwich, we can see a very wide range of architectures. We can see a range of a reconstructed Norman castle, reconstructed, of course, by the Victorians, believing that that was what Norman life was like. We can see next to it, near to it, with a spike on the top, one of the 40 medieval churches of Norwich. Once you've lived in a town with 40 medieval churches, you get rather used to the idea. They become rather like post boxes on the corner. But nonetheless, near to it is a neo-Swedish city hall. And then we see the cathedral more in the foreground. And another cathedral. Can you imagine the predicament that you would get in as a 19th century architect, even as famous a person as a member of the Gilbert Scott family, in being confronted with one of England's best cathedrals just down the hill? And then you had you landed the job, but my God, you had to compete with it. And which was a sort of no-win situation. But what I'm really referring to, less than these rather key elements at this point, is the kind of matrix that the whole thing makes. Quite a large part of this picture, after all, is represented by vegetation. And quite a large part of what is not vegetation is represented by a variety of roof types, not just pitched, not just Michael Hopkins trying to do a curve, not just by the neo-Swedish hiding the roof, etc., but by a whole conglomerate of bits and pieces and lumps and things interspersed with large amounts of space. About 2 weeks ago, I was stuck in Syracuse, and I didn't want to leave the hotel because the snow was very thick. So I took a photograph from the window while I was waiting to be rescued, so to speak. And I realized that when I looked at the photograph and recycled it to the audience later that day, that there was an inherent difference of attitude between North American towns of medium or small size and British towns of medium or small size. I'm not a great geographer, but I think that Syracuse and Norwich might be, give or take, in the same ballpark of population. But if you look at the actual mix, if you look at the actual nature, the porosity of the Norwich example, and then you look at the sort of block-headedness of the Syracuse example, both the rather small buildings in the foreground and the larger buildings in the background, mostly commercial, though some bits of university eking off to the left, you can see that there's a kind of curious blandness, a curious, dare I say it, I hope there are not too many Americans in the audience, a curious dumbness of the architecture. But of course in the United Kingdom we do have our own tradition of pomposity. One goes up the road, and we didn't have proper skyscrapers at that time, but nonetheless we wanted to build them. And we built them in a kind of reconstructed Georgian manner. It's easy for us to be rude about neo-Nazi architects in Stuttgart operating at the same time, but we should also look at our own heritage. And of course, one can discover various kinds of pomposity within the architecture of the 20th century, if we know where to look. A kind of relentless, dogmatic architecture. The relentlessness of the repeated interval, the repeated mullion, the repeated pilaster, has something that gets up my nose. It makes me start to itch. But my God, we have indeed, and you all know who these people are. They're in BD every week. We have our own current tradition of British pomposity. And the relentlessness is also there. But even people who one in many respects admired or admires, such as Louis Kahn, when asked to do so, or when feeling himself in a certain kind of cultural situation, would build extremely heavy, though a little bit more peculiar architecture. And we go to such architecture and admire it, perhaps as much for the man as for the substance. And even people who historically we would admire very much, even Sullivan's buildings or Dudok's buildings, upon which I was brought up. My first teacher in Bournemouth was a Dudok fan, and in the town you could discover secondary schools, of Hampshire secondary schools, that were in fact imitation, small scale and slightly ill-interpreted small-scale versions of Dudok's work. And after all, Sullivan's building here in Buffalo was greatly discussed and praised by my mentor, Rainer Banham. Then we take off. Quite where the takeoff occurred, perhaps if you can select precisely enough, you can say such drawings as Ladowski's on the right. But even people who are now in these rooms discuss more for his political ambition than for the actual stuff, such as Constant Nieuwenhuis. In fact, his stuff was very wild. People discuss less the wildness of it, more the fact of the pitch of the group. And in our own time, we have certain friends whose early work certainly was willing to be wild, willing to take off, willing to be dynamic. And if you know where to look, you can even find instincts of that in such mundane and third-rate buildings as the Blackpool Tower. And you can be selective about this. There was, of course, the period which I worked through from the sort of London branch of the radical architecture movement. And there were many, many parallels. Most of them are better known than Zundert, which is why I put theirs on the wall. Most of you know about Hollein and Pichler and Günter de Menig and Alfred Huth, and you know about Haus Rucker, and you certainly know about Himmelblau. But there were other groups in Vienna who perhaps weren't as clever, were a bit crude, but there was a tremendous fervent at that moment. But not wishing to nostalgia, what is interesting is that already Co-op Himmelblau were more refined than the rest. Back to Norwich, flanked by two contemporary examples. Back to the Norwich Cathedral. Those guys were pretty wild. If you look at those flying buttresses, they only had stone. They didn't have computers. They didn't probably even have extremely good measuring devices. They didn't quite know what the stone would do because they shipped it over from France anyway and stuck it on a Norfolk bog. But nonetheless, it's there to tell the tale, and it did marvellous, marvellous things spatially. The sorts of things which the two projects flanked, which are from the contemporary architectural world, from now, would probably give their back teeth to be able to do, certainly in stone. And I find myself venturing even into France, dare I say, where I think there has been a very interesting recent movement, say in the last 10 years, largely at the hands of Frederick Migeroux and other such people, to resuscitate the role played by France in relation to the mid to late 20th century avant-garde of ideas. And I'm not going to go into detail as to whether Bucky Fuller thought of it first and Emmerich was rather good at reinterpreting it. And I remain in France because going back in date, we have, after all, the extraordinary example of the glass house by Charot. A package of inventions, invention piled upon invention, in close packed condition. in very close packed condition, I like to make a kind of curious jump from the world of the Paris bourgeoisie in the 1930s and the Tokyo bourgeoisie in the 1980s or 1990s. Such architects as Takasaki are treated as loonies, even by the contemporaries. But in fact, I like to include such people as part of this itchy movement. Maybe non-solidity is about having a kind of itch. And one flays around discovering cross-referencing, cross conditions of inspiration between the Russians in the 20s, the special ones, the ones who would invent aeroplanes that could not possibly fly, and the naughty boys of the late 20th century, still very much at work in the 21st century, who don't care whether it doesn't fly, but certainly make their buildings spatially fly. And I come to somebody who has just, I think, beaten us twice recently in competition, but nonetheless for whom I have tremendous admiration. The couple of Reiser and Umemoto from New York. And it is no secret that Jesse Reiser himself, in addition to collecting bicycle magazines, which I find intriguing, is a specialist on the subject of the Wellington bomber, which after all, dare I say, not chauvinistically, was a British invention, was a geodesic structure. I think Barnes Wallis was involved there. And in fact, there is therefore this curious, and I'm drawing attention to it here, this curious link between the digital architects of the New York avant-garde and the British inventors of the Second World War. In fact, there are certain ideas that were not considered to be in the mainstream of architecture, which somehow the guys, certainly Reiser, but I think other people younger than him, have actually realized was part of their heritage too. Thus, if I go back to my own Plugland City, it was not just a business of mechanics. It was also concerned with spirit. It was concerned with spirit which, as it developed from the early stages represented by that drawing to the later stages as represented by this drawing, you will notice that there is a increased complexity between the first and the second. There's an increased vocabulary between the first and the second. And the second version undertakes to speculate upon the non-typical. It allows that perhaps the megastructure is a useful sort of rack upon which to pin certain things, but that the outcrop element, the single, almost sub-megastructure object, has its place too, and that the hovercraft has its place, and that the hanging element has its place, and that the sort of inflatable overcoat has its place. In other words, what is beginning is a composite vocabulary, and that perhaps non-solid also implies non-strict list. The one goes with the other. As one began to unravel the system, one took the maximum point of speculation that even the construct could disappear, could move, could become portable, like a circus, as if it came and went and had never happened. And various devices were thought of very quickly for that. I then moved to towers, which seemed to crop up. I will admit to you that I'm very scared of heights, which means that I get very woozy after about the 20th. I used to get woozy after about the 6th floor. I now can make it to about the 20th floor before I ask the hotel to put me somewhere else. And I don't like to look out of the window. But I still design towers. Now that will tell you a lot. Maybe that tells you about my sort of ability to double think. I can invent something which I would not like to go into, but I can see the reasonableness of making an invention. This is not meant to be a on the couch session. I'm not deeply worried about my psychology. I just mention it in passing. What is really more important to this discussion is the notion of the tower as an armature, as a device through which one can pass, through which certain conditions can ooze, and which might be used as an armature of provision. The funny, nice collage done on the right by somebody recently for me, it puts together lots of the towers and slightly misses the point, I suppose, but it's nice to just say, by the way, I'm showing you some, but not all of them. Aren't they pretty? On the left is more, in fact, horrifically old project. Was an armature based upon Taylor Woodrow's notion of a spun concrete television tower, which could be used like a kind of coat hanger, and upon which the rest would be pegged. A number of towers have come, some of them concerned with attaching onto a single sort of kebab stick, some of them concerned with landing very delicately upon the ground, some of them concerned with containing attached elements which themselves can rotate, most of them involving vegetation at one time or another, some of them involving water, certainly quite site-specific. The one on the left is to set its toenail into the River Seine in Paris. It's the Brits having their sort of back garden, but just delicately, not interfering with the physiognomy of Paris too much. The middle one is set in Hampstead, called Dampstead because Hampstead is damp, and setting only, as I say, a little tiny footstep onto the hills above Finchley Road. And the third one, located in my wife's city of Tel Aviv, a city full of entrepreneurs, and the tower itself shrieking entrepreneurship. Or earlier, and of course lately, as you will discover, finding oneself in Brisbane. The very old project on the left posits two alternative types of tower. The one predicting the fully sleek, air-conditioned tower. It predates the Gherkin somewhat. The one on the right is more interesting. The one on the right was really made from circumstantial going to funny sort of lunches and evenings in people's bungalows and people's 2 or 3 story houses up on legs, lifted above the marshland of Brisbane, where at the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century, it was full of bugs and got rather hot in the summer and rather sweaty. Therefore, you lifted the buildings up off the ground so that the bugs couldn't climb up so easily, and you opened the verandas to the breeze, very much in the British tradition of the bungalow, with initially the parts actually brought from places like Sheffield in ships until they started making them themselves. I looked at these bungalows and I thought, very simplistically, why not stick them one on top of the other? Why not make one tower of a series of these ventilated conditions, which I will return to in a current project, indeed. The other thing that inspired me was this piece of freeway, which was there then in the 80s and is certainly still there now, which I find is one of the most agreeably styled pieces of freeway, though some of the Brisbane people grumble because it interferes with their connectivity with the river, but they've got lots of river to connect to, shouldn't worry. And I love the notion of the mechanical elements dangled in this sort of no man's land between the water and the city. And if you notice, the drawing on the left then starts to appropriate pieces of that no man's land. Much, much more recently, in fact last year, one's forays into the speculation of the tower as a kind of vehicle for a collage is rather obvious. In this case, the structure is there if you know where to look for it, but is not expressed as a surface condition. And in fact, I suppose, strictly speaking, this is dangerously close to a piece of solid architecture. It's solid architecture that is in the process of being eaten away, but most of it is still solid. So I should be, this evening, should I not, I should be questioning it rather heavily. Another aspect of anti-solidity is to do with the day and the night. I think that there is certain architecture which comes to be much more relaxed at night, where you are less aware of its sort of Brobdingnagian heaviness. And if you are in the sweet Nordic countries, of course, you also have that advantage of electricity dealing with the long, dark evenings. Inspired by such a thing, it was inevitable that one of my tower sets would be using those same lanterns and perching them up as the tower and turning themselves into windows and turning themselves into apartments. A link between the lamp and the window, so to speak. Recently, and some of the people who worked on this are sitting in the audience, we suggested an armature for Taiwan. An armature that is fundamentally a pylon with droplets hanging off it. So now we don't have necessarily plugged in solid parts. We don't necessarily have skins. We don't necessarily have hanging gardens. We don't necessarily have drapes. What we have now are kind of sacks and droops and tits, almost, dare I say, in such august company, which hang off the armatures. And the armatures are structured. In fact, even though this was an ideas competition, we still worked with Happold's because we wanted it to work as a structure. And in fact, the parts hang. On the left, we see a kind of semi-abstracted version which shows the components in their sets, in their types. And on the right, we have a picture of sort of birds flying around halfway up the tower. And as we progress, we see that in fact what's going on in those sacks and tits and balloons is the growing of algae. And the algae is hanging there, and the punters, the visitors, move up the tower and watch this kind of vegetational effect. But conceptually, it is a pylon with droplets. And so one is beginning to suggest, I suppose in a roundabout way, that non-solid architecture requires something for it to be there, but does not demand that that something should be fully filled in. That's in very simple terms. And one comes back to the notion through that of the aerated city. One goes back behind architecture to enjoyed and generated conditions. We enjoy the notion not only of the sun bursting through the trees, but of the wind whistling through the trees or gently passing through the trees. We enjoy conditions where perhaps in romantic circumstances, water and undergrowth and vegetation and even something, if you take a trick photograph, or somebody took this trick photograph, where you get the implication of a more complex structure than in the simple trees go up and sun comes through version. And after all, in the country that is suffering, but perhaps Kyoto less than other parts, there is the extraordinary ability of the Japanese temperament and the Japanese sensibility and the Japanese sophistication of tradition to use these ingredients as an extremely complex, layered, but always filtered, always breathing set of conditions. Little doubt, therefore, that in our shadow house many years ago, Christine Hawley and I were inspired by such things as the Ryanji Gardens and tried to think of a mechanical, if you like, a mechanical or built version of the same sensibility. But one can look around one again to France, to a building across the street from the building I often find myself in, where in its slightly stiff way, the Fondation Cartier is this business of allowing the breathing between the parts of the building, and even a sort of gesture to desolidify even the principal pavilion. Or in Los Angeles, Tom Main and the boys create a place which again is a filtration of space. And no wonder the people who work on organising buses in the district enjoy working there. But one had made one's own forays into the proposition of the filter building, of again using vegetation, where the skin of the building hardly exists. There is just, if you look closely, a demarcation between enclosure and non-enclosure, but the whole thing is a kind of loose forest derivative. And many further examples of this. Always attempting, and I'm not a very light touch sort of person, but attempting a certain kind of lightness of touch. It's always dangerous to include one's most known project, and it would be false to leave it out of the lecture. And so what one is doing is in a roundabout way, re-examining it and trying to decide whether it has anything to say to this particular conversation. Surely the bubble itself is a total secret object, and in a sense depends upon the solidity of the proposition in order for it to be special and secret, though you pick holes into it. But it is between that solid and other solids that I think the building gives the game away. I think I cannot claim for it that it is part of the universal digital rolling architecture, though for a period it was included as one of the what do they call them? The bumps, the boils of architecture. But in fact, its composition is much more modernist than that. It's much more an elemental building, where a series of elements, of which the animal part is but one of 4 or 5. And in fact, it is held apart quite deliberately from other parts of the building. And in fact, elements of it are quite admittedly drawn from the constructivist oeuvre. And even the skin itself, our intention, Colin and I had the intention really to have many more of these blisters, many more. We were allowed to do 2 till the city got very worried and nervous and said, you know, they're going to get very expensive, we have lots of that. And now I think they're also nervous of the ambiguity, because we didn't see it as a total solid. We saw it as a kind of skin that would go to several moments of near exposure, and therefore very ambiguous, almost like a film. But 2 moments were allowed, and I think those are still, at least conceptually, keys to a major aspect of the whole building. But it was still called a blob. It still was in various articles in The Guardian and elsewhere, part of the march of the blobs. But if we look at the plan, and I'm only showing one plan here, there was the straightforward and much broadcast conceptual starting point that the building was a skin with a pin running up through it. Pin and skin. As I come to look at the result of the building, as I experience it many times, I realize that what was just as important was the existence of interstitial space between the blob with the skin and the pre-existent building which we had to reconstruct, and also some other buildings on the site at the back. And that the blob, in a sense, is more of an animal that can conceptually almost roll around, and the wind whistles through it. Maybe I'm post-rationalizing, but it allows me to lead directly to a more recent project, which I believe Jesse and his wife, Raiza Namamoto, beat us in the competition for, and I wish them well. But ours was not a bad skin too. And ours was, in fact, a series of parts that, in a sense, floated one above the other. There was a very conscious effort, and my co-authors are sitting in the back here. There was a conscious effort not to congeal it, to set it as a series of elements that almost loosely hung around. And even here in this drawing, one sees that there is actually air between the roof, the glass roof of this part of the building and the next pieces of building above. They very deliberately do not connect by something like 3 floors worth. And there are many such conditions in the project. And that each layer almost has its own life and is percolated between. Rather difficult plan to follow, but in fact several of these parts that you see as shapes are not only not on the same plane, but, as I say again, hardly or do not connect. And even when the building lands on the ground, it hardly lands on the ground. Probably only 35% of it actually lands on the ground per se. And the buildings are mostly loosely laid above. And here you see the ground condition, which is, much of it is parkland of a small scale. And there are antecedents for this thinking too in a little project for Breitscheidplatz in Berlin. One was, again, winding walkways around space, having the minimum necessary that was actually posited onto the ground, and the most of it hoping to absorb sort of market stalls and such things as one was able to develop here in this later project in Spain, where though the big red object, cousin of Graz, is the key thing on the site, and there are a number of other substantial objects on the site, it is the boardwalk, it is the wind deliberately being caught and pushed through between these buildings. It is the fluency of the boardwalk, it is the fluency of its entrails, it is the amelioration of the little kiosks and so on that can come and go that are just as important. I think that's the end of that bit, but I might have lost something somewhere. No, we didn't. That's the end of that bit. Okay, more to come. Another freedom, though, is the freedom to think out of the grey biscuit box. I believe that the first of my next series of regular articles in the Architectural Review came out this morning. And in this I argue away from the grey and the biscuit, which rather accompanies the architecture of those pompous fellow Londoners. Colour is a freedom. It's interesting to speculate upon what was going on through Peter Berentz's mind as he made really his first major interior building, the Hearst offices in Frankfurt. The drawing, probably not by him, but the drawing shows a kind of magic world. I think the reality is even more magic, though the colours are more subtle. Whatever one thinks of this kind of slightly churchy romanticism, and I quite like it, to be honest, it is the coloration of it that it must have been quite extraordinary for the Hessische burghers at the time working at their Adler typewriters. It must have been quite a curious place to be in, and hasn't been followed up sufficiently, in my view. In Madrid, again, using the progeny of the Pinto project that you just saw, one has been able to make, with Gabin, a blue building. Spain is very poor. The building got halfway up and stopped for more than a year. We feared that it would never happen. It is happening. What has been lost in the process is the degree of blueness. It ain't as blue as it was. Does that mean that some bean counter in Madrid or somewhere thinks that if you make it bluer, it will be more expensive? But thank God they've left the bottom, and that hopefully, and now this is me photoshopping on the statement, kiosks and lively things coming and going underneath. This is, I hope to hell they will come and go underneath. If they put some bloody grey huts under there, I shall spit, but there we are. And of course the intention was that all sorts of very strange things should happen on the roof and underneath, and I've made allusions to hamburgers on various occasions with this project. Sometimes one is sitting in a concrete box building, looking out the window, as Yell and I were a year or so back, at another concrete box building. And though we were enjoying Santa Monica, we said, what a pain that you come all the way to Santa Monica. It's wonderful, the west of the west of the west, the dream. There's the sun setting over the Pacific, and you put a bloody great concrete chunk up. And I couldn't stand it, so I just drew the alternative. There is no client for this. Elsewhere in Liverpool, one did a project which was a drape, where deliberately the innards poke out. In other words, it was non-solid. It wasn't even a complete sheath. It was a very, very perforated sheath. Very important to perforate it. But sometimes one makes studies for projects where the imperfection of the sheath is more important than just doing the dumb thing and making it all the same all the way around. And in the Comfo Veg Club, which you will recognize already as my screensaver, one was attempting in a very loose way to combine 2 or 3 preferred traditions, that of color, that of vegetation, that of comfort, and that of enjoying a glass of something in a club. And also suggesting that each of these traditions does not have a very ordered result, that in fact it might be the vegetation under certain circumstances that is more ordered than the furniture, though the reverse is usually true. Right this afternoon, the person of the discussion is in the audience, we were discussing the fact that the Viennese want us to use cheaper paint, but we're trying to stick to our guns, not use expensive paint deliberately, but there are certain attitudes towards the relationship of color and position. In this case, the attitude runs thus, that near the ground you have the solid earthy color. Near the sky you have the light and bright and shining color. And between the two you have a gradation of the one to the other. It's a very, very pathetically simple prognosis. And after all, I can always say that if you know where to look in Vienna, and you have to look rather hard, it was even Otto Wagner himself in the market area who did a coloured building with flowers on it. But you have to look pretty hard in Vienna. It's pretty grey most of the time. You have to look very hard in Birmingham too, and in fact it's Foreign Office who will have the benefit of winning this particular competition with, I suspect, I'm almost certain, a monochromatic building that might wobble around a bit. In our case, we thought of Birmingham to need a colour situation where the red parts of the building would look to the red street, and the blue part of the building would look to the late Jan Kaplitsky's blue building, and that the white part of the building would look south and reflect the light, and that between the white part and the red bit you would go via orange, and between the blue part and the white part you would go green. We managed to massage the local conditions so that there was a response between the streets. And it was ventilated again underneath itself. Not completely non-solid, but enjoying itself nonetheless. in the Taipei pop strip, the process was a loosening, attempted to loosen simultaneously on two different fronts. The one front loosening from the very hard and orthogonal architecture, though in this case a kind of distilled version of that, to a looser architecture at the other end. The hard facing the city, the loose facing the countryside. And on the other hand, running through a kind of spectral change of color, so that as the formal loosening was happening, there was also a kind of color abstraction happening. Intriguingly, and this is a sort of middle condition, where it's neither one nor t'other, but as we can see in this complete layout of the model, you can see that on the right-hand side, the looser end, the coloration becomes more abstract, becomes just simply metal. Whereas when it becomes hard architecture, it goes into bright colors. But of course there is a ribbon of orange path, which looking at myself as a sort of an analyst of myself, I realize is being the child of the Smithsons, that there's still a trace of the kind of Smithson-like Team 10 high-level walkway hanging on in there. I think this is one of our favorite projects that got away. In this case, I think we have to take the blue panels around the blob, and again it's a cousin of Gratz in certain respects, as indicating something that would have gone further than Gratz. If you remember that bit of melted skin in Gratz, and then you reverse it and say that the whole skin would be the melted skin, and you would only solidify where there is the blue patch, you begin then to get another kind of blob architecture, developed blob architecture, where in fact even the skin itself is neither totally transparent nor is it totally solid, but it is not a compromise between the two. It is actually a game played between the two, relatively randomly. The business of superimposition of color is also something which we're only tentatively thinking about, where you start off with the proposition of a completely white building, but you consider its nighttime coloration as effectively a major part of the architecture. And then black itself can be manipulated. And more importantly, it can be aerated. I look to Gavin sitting in the second row as really being the primary author of this project, and pre-aerating his building, winding it around its neighbor, winding it down into space, and then fragmenting it. So again, it appears to be black, but it is not solid. If London did flood, and the principal person who worked on these drawings is also sitting, I think, in the audience, so I hope I don't misinterpret everything. But here, London floods, and there are memories of an earlier project that Gavin and I did for the eastern part of London, which we take as the point of departure model for this. The megastructures here are deliberately loose because they're made of flotsam and jetsam. They're made of rubbish, basically. Grabbed together rubbish, almost as rather like the desperate, it's rather horrendous. The physiognomy of these stacks most resembles the effects of the tsunami. If you look at photographs of tsunami piles, and then you imagine that gathered up and slung around into space, into a hollow tree where you climb up and you do your thing, you do whatever is left available for you to do in an emergency. And it hangs out, and it is by definition loose and open and vegetated, all being well. At our son's birthday party 2.5 years ago, for a whole collection of his friends, every one of these, We still know most of them. Every one of these is now at university. Every one of them is sitting in a concrete box room or something along the lines of. They're nearly all, I think they're all at British universities, so that I can fairly safely, full of re-entrant edges, so there are lots of kooky corners. Then the layer of the louvers, and then the waft of the trees, and the three are really conceptually related. As we see in this plan, there are lots of strange places where you can hover, not just sitting in classroom. And that when we come to the library, there's even more of that hovering, and even more of that loose percolation of space, and air wafting through from the garden across into the library. And pieces of the building draped onto the bridges that make up the library. And that is the condition on site. I think it's an old photo. It's already a few weeks old. Finally, I move to the very present moment. We have that building underway, and we find ourselves having won another university competition in Australia, of all places, and we're catching the breeze. You remember that one was way back in Queensland 20-odd years ago, suggesting catching the breeze out of these bungalows. We find ourselves now on demand of catching the breeze. I can see Gavin grinning because it's preoccupying us the day. Catching the breeze in Queensland. Catching the breeze with, nonetheless, a piece of very definite architecture. Quite conscious of its architecturalness. And loose in that the whole thing has air flowing through it and open wafts and open cleavages between the parts of the roof and whole and layers and bridges, and which make it a sort of interesting building to pursue. I have, as you know, been teaching for 40-something years. It's an unnecessarily long time. And in a sense, and even Gavin has been teaching for more than 10 years, and with our colleague in Australia, Britt Anderson, we made a statistic that suggested the three of us have been teaching for 110 years, which means that you know a little bit about what goes on in architecture schools, since we have attended and taught in a number. And so it raises the issue of designing through anecdote, not just through principle, not just through procedure, not just through preferred armatures, but actually from anecdote. Though we will start with the architectural principles, a series of components loosely dangled one into the other, based around scoops and a wrap. The scoops are these, each slightly different, curved support, wind catch, light catch elements, and the wrap meanders around the edge. Some anecdotes. I found that the Austrian syndrome was perhaps something to be continued. So these are a whole series of quotes or imagined quotes of typical situations that go on in schools of architecture. The pompous question asked by the picky juror, the nervousness on the face of the guy whose model is probably not complete and won't work, the embarrassment of the juror who with the spiky hose heard it before. But it is the architecture that matters, the space that matters, the catching of the breeze and the hoarding of the light. Well, there is a tradition in architecture schools of doing things, making things, and one is making the point here that even though our concrete parts, if they are, might be well fashioned, that wouldn't obviate somebody coming along and painting them purple and sticking silly things on them and hanging silly things from the roof. And Glenda might or might not object to them following the drawing. That architecture schools are full of pomposity and bullshit and silly seminars and somebody up in, at least in the building where you can escape into the balcony and say fingers to all that. Or that architect, I remember when I taught in this building, which I did for 20 odd years, the important thing was to have a route of escape. When I moved to Frankfurt and then moved to the Bartlett, but the first thing that you do is to figure out how you can escape somebody very boring heading your way. Because architecture schools are entirely made up of that kind of condition. Also, of course, the student may wish to escape. This particular one has not been so fortunate. And that the point of the scoops and the wrap is to do with cooling the building. We are, after all, in Queensland. I don't know why this one is slow. And that the formation of the building, then, you see it is extremely aerated. There are lots of gaps and filters and thinly draped layers. And there is a path through the middle, which is a street, and then the various things hanging off it, that the skin is itself a series of almost like a mouth organ. I know from my experience at the Bartlett, which is has been a very creative school, that very often somebody's making something and we design the building with a pit, rather like, it's a sort of quote, the Bartlett pit is not a pretty one, but the idea is great, where you have the workshop, it's a key part of the school, and then it opens itself out to life, to people coming in the door. Everybody who comes into the door has to see what the workshop's doing. We simply borrowed that, and pulled it around a bit, made it better and bigger. And there's always some Charlie who's making something that seemed a good idea at the time. It's a wonderful phrase. I think I greatly admire people who do things that seemed a good idea at the time. And sometimes they even seem a good idea a bit later. But you have to have everybody pulling them and doing stuff. Or you get extremely boring people. Architecture schools are full of very boring people. And as a young member of faculty, you have to be polite. You notice the loving cynicism in my voice. There are two members of the faculty who are just hoping to escape off for a drink, and some Burke comes up and says, I thought you might find this interesting. Of course, it is not at all interesting, but nonetheless, it's the rule of the game that you should be seen to find it interesting. And there is the pit around which you can wish you could throw the guy once he's shown you this uninteresting. But it is also important, I think, schools of architecture, this one, of course, makes a habit of it, makes a speciality of it. I think it's very important for all schools of architecture to be very open to visitors. Those that hide away and never ask anybody to visit them have something to hide. Even in the Gold Coast, one would hope that people would be passing and see what's going on. This is very important. And that, of course, there are certain social implications built around the way we have organized the building. We hope that it would be possible for the sad creature in the purple pullover to still maintain the hope that the girl on the next balcony might take some interest in him if he hung around long enough. We know life isn't like that, but in architecture schools you have to provide for it, or for strange things that go on late into the night, and the friend who is in the background. You notice I'm constantly putting people who are just off the picture, hoping that they don't get involved in an unsatisfactory situation. And that there have to be places where you can hide away and just look on the little screen. After all, that's the principal activity. or you can deal with bits of 8x4 chipboard, a necessary activity in a good school of architecture, not just deal with delicate little things you can carry in a plastic case. And that, you know, you have to allow for a bit of human life there. We did make one adjustment to this drawing, because originally we called the female Kylie, but we had not presented for the competition. We thought they might think we were sending them up, so we changed it to Josie. And of course there are certain things which are best discussed out of the building. If the Birkin Blue must go ahead and present the project, fuck him, okay, let him go ahead with it, but let's not discuss it in the room. But the architecture is the most important thing. Of course it is. Even though, as we well know in the AA, that what is very important is it is seen to be a place where everything is happening, and it's always happening, even as this evening there are 4 things happening at once. But the architecture is the primary cause, and its ability to catch the light, not the direct sunlight, that's very important in Queensland, but the light and the breeze, and to be an amusing place even for people who are pompous and like to come from famous places, or even that might one day welcome Zaha herself. Talking about another of her many buildings. And on the north, it is the hot side, and the building ameliorates itself accordingly. What is most important is the tweaking. This was the cartoon that I made at the end of the competition presentation to say that what is important, both in architecture school, is it is not definitively always a good project or a bad project. It's how you tweak. And what you do in a design studio, in an office, mostly is tweak. And it's the nature, the level, and the ambition of the tweaking that is most important. And so, symbolically, yesterday afternoon, I took a quick picture of what was going on a tabletop, where we are literally, as of yesterday and today, tweaking the scoops. And developing the plan to a much more refined and buildable stage. Already it's a very fast-track project, I'm glad to say. We have a little studio nearby. Sometimes, bottom left, it's a delight that the old members of Archigram, the still living members of Archigram, came, and significantly in relation to the bomber, Mike Webb is drawing an aeroplane, and Gavin is looking very serious, is about to himself then draw an aeroplane. David Green doesn't look as if he wants to draw an aeroplane, and I'm there to take the picture. More typical situations, top left, a situation where the articulate and the imaginative have, just as in school, to argue and present their ideas. And a picture, again, taken yesterday, where you can see that the scoops are there about to be manipulated on the table. This, I would like to thank everybody concerned, those in the room, not in the room, not yet in the room. Thank you.
Any questions for Peter? Thanks, Peter, for the great lecture. Anyone willing to shoot a question? Yes, no? Yep. Okay.
Just a quick question. If it's non-solid, is it void?
No, if it's non-solid, it's all hanging around there. It's a good question. Because once, when I ran a thing called ArtNet many, many years ago, we had a thing called the Conceptual Architecture Conference, about, God help us, 25 years ago. And Colin Rowe came to talk, and so did Will Alsop and various other people. And Colin Rowe spent about an hour with several glasses in his hand, arguing the notion of the non-existence of architecture. And then he said it was like the idea of God, but I can't remember the detail. It's all written down in the magazine. So, no, if it's not solid, it's not there. It's not congealed. That was the implication. No, not necessarily invisible. There's a difference between solidity and visibility. That's a strong implication. It's not a demand, but it's an implication. I think it's just a cyclic thing, because obviously, as you well know, at a certain point, in archigram work, or certainly my part of archigram work, the proposition was that everything would be expendable. But even then, I suppose, then I remember that there were certain categories or degrees of expendability. There were like 30-year bits, and 10-year bits, and 5-minute bits, and 40-year bits. And then gradually you realize that what is interesting, I think, is that nearly every building that we inhabit is in a constant process of change. Even this building we're in now, which is a listed building, and I know it well, has had a number of changes made to it in the years that I've known it, but with certain parts that are not allowed to be changed, other parts where somebody starts to decide to not let you have the key, others where you pretend that you haven't changed it, but you have. But most buildings are looser than this, even within the strictures of, maintain the Georgian front. I think that what I'm sort of attacking, I hope fairly obviously, is a sort of tendency on the part of certain English architects to make very pompously solid their buildings in a rather grim way. Although that would be a slightly different lecture, but I couldn't resist having that as a point of departure at the beginning, because it's an instinct. I didn't even have this title sort of 3 months ago. I come upon it as a title, and I may well abandon it or move on to another title. I think, and that's why I think for me the most questions I have in terms of one's own work is about the Graz building, to what extent it is a solid or non-solid building. And I fall back on the analysis that conceptually or organizationally it is not solid, though the major part of it is clearly dependent upon it being a kind of total mystery pomegranate. But as soon as you erect that, it's a question of then what you do with the interference with the skin, just as why I particularly drew attention to the interior of Gavin's building in Estonia, which I say Gavin's because although we all do everything in the office, in fact there are certain people who are conceptually responsible, even if their hand is not on the button. And I think that's something which has interested me for a long time. I think another lecture, which I shall not now give as an answer to a question, but another lecture which has occurred to me to talk about at some time is the tyranny of the ground plane and the tyranny of the window. But I'll just leave you with those two titles as a sort of hint of something I might pursue.
Yeah.
I see you seem very interested in the painting either before or after the... I see you're very interested in the paintings, either before or after the...
The voice is gone.
Is that any better? Before or after the buildings are actually built. Your description of non-solid made me think of the kind of layered paintings, or paintings on top of paintings, or the palimpsest paintings you sometimes find. Do you see any connection yourself in that way?
No. It's interesting that you use the term painting, though your first language is English, yeah?
Yes.
Because I've sometimes, in my travels, have had somebody asking me about the paintings, and it's usually somebody whose first language is not English. Therefore, they use the term painting to refer to what I would refer to as drawings. And I suppose it's a prejudice that, in a way, I'm more comfortable with the notion of the drawing than I am with the notion of the painting. Just as I'm more comfortable with the notion of the drawing than I am with the notion of the diagram, or I'm more comfortable with the notion of the drawing than I am with the notion of the cartoon. I admit that the cartoons are there as a kind of anecdotal subordinate role. They are not necessarily conceptual. They come after the event, and they come as a mental reminder of anecdote. I think one puts paint on in swathes of paper. Here and there, yes, there are sort of fully filled drawings. And I'm not sure whether I'm not suspicious of those. They're easy to do. I find them very easy to do, very enjoyable to do. When I'm doing that big tower, which I did last year, I just did it, just sat down and did it over several days, and somebody in Paris bought it, which is also rather good. And but I'm not sure whether sometimes sort of conceptually one is slightly avoiding the issue, because the potential of a drawing is to invent its own terms of reference. In other words, it can hold any value system within the premise of the drawing, and then decide that one of those values is best represented by a figure, something is best represented by a patch, something else might be best represented by a quotation. You only have to go up to Cedric Price's room upstairs to see the value in Cedric's work of the statement, and the existence or the presence on the drawing of it as a sort of catalogue reference. Cedric used to read about 8 newspapers every morning before his couple of brandies at 8 o'clock and in the morning, and his drawings are very much a digest of what he would have read. But I digress. I think the premise of the drawing, or the conceptual potential of a drawing, is that it chooses to lay down on the paper whatever it happens to choose at that moment. Whereas as soon as you say a painting, for me, maybe a painter would say they do the same thing, but for me, it then means that the patch that is occupied has to follow a certain kind of type discipline. But I haven't pre-thought this. I mean, I'm just making this up as I go along.
That's the point of the style, making it up as you go along, of course. The thing I was thinking about maybe isn't us making paintings of our buildings, but I was thinking of the layering and the partial transparencies and the way in which one sees through.
I think I prefer collage to painting. I think that the collage, to me, has a much more creative progeny than the painting. This is because again the collage has the potential, if I sort of take this piece of lemon out of the glass here and this piece of chalk on here, I can decide that they collage in a certain sort of way, and they have the potential to recollage. Once I've painted them on there, they tend to be rather stuck. But again, I'm making this up as I go along. I think there are certain, and again, you know, when everyone gives a lecture, this is of course freezing certain words, it's freezing certain concepts, and we all, you know, I arrive in this room with 50 years or whatever it is of prejudices, developed prejudices, and you say painting to me, and I think, oh fuck, I'm being cornered into being a painter.
The things I'm thinking about are, for example, the partially faded, decayed, painted adverts on the sides of walls of buildings that only half the building is still there, and they're very appealing to people.
But that's something else. That's patina. That's to do with patina, nostalgia, the non-perfect situation. That, I think, is something else. That's another conversation. That's another conversation.
Any other questions?
Having pursued this distinction of non-solid architecture and looked at it in some detail over quite a long period of time, do you, as one of your cartoon characters said, have you come to regard it as a fundamental distinctive quality that you can categorize architecture by?
I've only been sort of consciously thinking about it for about 2 or 3 months. Give me a bit longer, I might answer you. I might find it. I don't think I'll find it's a false trail. I think as soon as you make a definition, I'm making a definition of that which I wish to avoid, that which I do not like, that which I find distasteful, that which I find irritatingly prevalent. It's using the opposite as a point of departure. Now, that raises the issue, or the question as to whether you should use a positive as a point of departure or a negative as a point of departure. I haven't done that before. Most of the things I've always said I'm for or I'm doing are a positive, like when I say skin and pin, or when I say, skin and scoop or whatever. These are positives. These are things that one's really, really going for. To say, it mustn't be that, is I find it a bit odd myself, but I'll tell you in half a year's time. It'll either turn itself into a book or I will abandon it.
Okay. Sir Peter Cook, it's always an honor to have you in the house. Thank you very, very much.